So the title of this talk is Epistemic and Methodological Empiricism. For those who are at the workshop and are watching this again, maybe it's quite clear that this isn't the talk that I gave. This isn't the recorded talk of the talk that I gave at the workshop. I stupidly forgot to record myself, so this is me re-recording it in my flat. But hopefully I capture the sort of the key components I gave at the talk. So what I aim to do is three things. I want to highlight two distinct styles of empiricism. I want to show that how Van Frissens and Cartwright fit into these historical strains. I want to show that one, namely methodological empiricism, has been largely neglected in current philosophy of science when it comes to analyzing and critiquing empiricism. So I take the third one to be, third aim to be the most important, to be especially important, because if philosophers who have tried to get rid of empiricism, who have tried to critique and analyze empiricism, haven't been focusing on empiricism as a totality, but have only focused on one strain, or at least neglected this methodological empiricism, then the critique hasn't really been sufficient. So the outline is, firstly, I'm going to sketch out the epistemic tradition. Secondly, sketch out the methodological tradition. Thirdly, fit Van Frissens and Cartwright into the two, and then show that criticism, or actually been of the epistemic variety. This is going to consist in just me showing some quotations from current philosophy of science that I take to be quite emblematic of this. So epistemic empiricism, the first thing I should say is that both epistemic empiricism and methodological empiricism, clearly in virtue of being empiricists, they have experience as a central component of what the positions are. With epistemic empiricism, it's sort of the standard view of empiricism. When we think of traditional accounts of empiricism of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, although this narrative, I think, is overly simplistic and gets some parts wrong, there is a central, the central part of this, namely that Locke, Berkeley, and Hume are empiricists in an important sense, I think, stands true, and we can sort of use this as an important marker. Name is taken with modification from Allen. He calls it epistemological empiricism, but I'm definitely not suggesting here that he's creating the term or any such thing like this. It's just what the term refers to has been, it is the dominant understanding of what empiricism is. So I take it to have several components. The first is an individualistic component, which says something like, the significance of experience is predominantly centered around epistemic issues and from an individualistic perspective. Experience is essential to and limits what we should believe about the world, and this experience is considered from the perspective of the individual human observer. So next one, centrality of sense perception. Experience and observing is construed around sensory perception. The third one is elimination of metaphysics or no metaphysics. Doesn't generally claim to have knowledge about unobservable structures or entities, where unobservable is demarcated along the lines of the human observer. Based more theoretically than practically, or we can call this theory-led. Influenced by skepticism, and the skepticism is epistemically focused. We can call this epistemic skepticism. Most famous examples of these are the classical empiricists of Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Pierre Gassendi, I would say, is another philosopher from the early modern period who really exemplifies elements of this. And really important to say that the epistemology that they're focused on here it's a philosophy first epistemology. It's not an epistemology that wants to analyze science and do epistemology through looking at what we know through that. It's pushing a framework onto science. It's deriving a framework from philosophy and consequence of, say, 4, which is theory-led, and the individualistic element. It's a real theoretical contemplation of this. It's individualistic. It's thinking about what the limits of our knowledge are, how we get our knowledge, and all from a very theoretical, individualistic framework. And in this sense, I think it's very it's a continuation of the Cartesian tradition in the sense of an individual contemplating on things and trying to work out what they can know through this abstract individualistic contemplation on things. Methodological empiricism, again, experience is at the forefront. The name is taken from Woolhouse. He talks about it a little bit in his book on empiricism. He talks about it explicitly with reference to Francis Bacon, who he says to be the epitome of methodological empiricism. And I think this is a really good first characterization. If you want to get a sort of a broad understanding, a quick glimpse into what I mean and what Woolhouse means, it's sort of like the philosophy of Francis Bacon, the empiricism of Francis Bacon. So I should say something quickly about the way I'm sort of presenting these qualities. It's not none of these conditions that I'm putting out are necessary or sufficient, either jointly or singularly. If anything, it's more of a family resemblance style approach to this. So methodological empiricism, the focus is still on experience, but now it's on using experience to investigate the world. So the methodology term comes from what they're trying to do. What this style of empiricism does is it advocates an empiricist method whereby empirical investigation into the world is seen as the best way to proceed. It's not overly concerned on the significance of the individual human's perspective, and philosophy first epistemic issues don't take a central role. It's focused far more on practice rather than on theory. There's a lack of focus or even a dismissal of the observable for human significance. We can call this the non-centrality of sense perception, and generally a willingness to endorse some sort of metaphysics in comparison to the epistemic tradition. So the most famous examples I would take to be people like Francis Bacon, Hooke, Boyle, Glanville, yeah, and obviously Cartwright, who I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, but for now I think this is fine. So Van Fraasen's empiricism, what I really want to make clear that I'm going to talk about his empiricism and his constructive empiricism, but the style that I'm going to fit into the epistemic tradition is the constructive empiricism. Van Fraasen's empiricism I take to be broader than the epistemic understanding, but also probably not sufficient really to fit into the methodological characterization also. I'll say why this is, but the reason I'm including the empiricism is because I think it's important to give a bit of a broader understanding of Van Fraasen's understanding of empiricism, and also just to sort of sketch out briefly what Van Fraasen thinks of this. So it's mainly found in a series of essays that developed from the early to mid-90s in selected segments, and then becomes more fully developed in The Empirical Stance, which is published in 2002. It's interesting to note, I think, that this formulation of empiricism, as distinct from constructive empiricism, comes over 10 years after around about 10 years after Scientific Image is published, where constructive empiricism is first sketched out. Even as late as 1989 in Laws of Symmetry, he describes empiricism in the sense that he will later go on to criticize as naive. He says he defines it as in the introduction of Laws of Symmetry as experience is our one and only source of information. His empiricism is opposed to transcendental empiricism. It's opposed to any sort of foundationalism, and it's against naturalized epistemologies, where the central argument behind what a successful formulation of empiricism looks like is that empiricism cannot have a main tenet or a main dogma on pains of contradiction. And what we do instead is we replace it by a stance. We have certain attitudes as empiricists. For example, we have respect for scientific modes of inquiry. We have a rejection of metaphysical inquiry. And we see as virtue the idea of rationality that doesn't bar disagreement. So in some ways, it seems like his understanding here of empiricism is broad enough to fit into both epistemic and methodological tradition, especially this focus on scientific inquiry and scientific practice. And the stance is left purposely broad to allow it to be general. And I'm perfectly happy to say that what the empiricism of Van Fraassen is, it's not as narrow as constructive empiricism. And it probably wouldn't, I wouldn't want to say that it fits neatly into this epistemic empiricism. There's two points though that make me think it doesn't capture the whole range of empiricism properly, i.e. it doesn't really capture the style of methodological empiricism I've talked about. And that is this quotation to start with. He says, empiricist philosophers have always concentrated on epistemology, the study of knowledge, belief, and opinion, with a distinct tendency to advocate the importance of opinion. So it's this latter part that I want to take, put the focus on. Advocating the importance of opinion implies some sort of skeptical attitude towards knowledge and towards certainty. We don't have, with the view being that we can't have this idea of certainty. There's nothing that I take in the method. The way I would understand the methodological tradition, the way I'm trying to sketch it out is that they wouldn't really be concerned with this, or at least it wouldn't really be at the forefront of what they're trying to do. And I mean, Francis Bacon, for example, is explicitly, he thinks we can have certain knowledge if we just adhere to the correct method, which is a method through focus on experiment, dismissal of sense perception, and a focus on induction. Similarly, other empiricists, sorry, I take Cartwright as well, wouldn't really be too focused on epistemology as like a central part of what she's trying to do. And he argues that empiricism, the history of empiricism is a recurrent rebellion against the metaphysicians, and treats empiricism as a strong anti-metaphysical trend. So again, this is definitely true of the epistemic tradition, but I don't really see it fitting that neatly into the methodological tradition. Certainly Cartwright, as we're going to see in just a second, would not want to hold to this. So I think there's a really important way that how he understands empiricism isn't really broad enough to capture this alternative tradition. So it's constructive empiricism that I really take to be representative of epistemic empiricism in current philosophy of science. And just a precursor, constructive empiricism, according to Van Fraassen, is just one way amongst others that you could formulate empiricism. So the way that Van Fraassen is presenting empiricism is how he thinks the sort of the limits of empiricism and how you could possibly formulate it. Constructive empiricism is the specific way that he wants to formulate empiricism and that he is advocating for. We have two main components to constructive empiricism. We have the aim of science, and we have individual theory acceptance, or what it is for an individual to accept the theory. So the aim of science is empirical adequacy, and this is understood not from the perspective of the individual scientist, but it's understood from the perspective of the scientific community. So it doesn't really matter what the aim of an individual scientist is, it matters what the aim of the scientific community is, and he takes this to be empirical adequacy. So what it means for an individual to accept a theory has two further subdivisions. We have the epistemic component, which states that all you need to believe when you accept a theory is in the empirical adequacy, and you need to believe in the observables. And so he says you don't need to believe in unobservable entities. He doesn't restrict this. He doesn't say you can't believe in unobservable entities, but he says it might be missing something of the spirit of constructive empiricism if you're not believing in it. The pragmatic component is to do with things that you need, elements of a theory that you need to accept that go beyond epistemic, that aren't included in the epistemic. So, for example, to accept a theory is you enter into this sort of research program in it, and whereby you're going to give explanations in that fit into this theory. You're going to explain scientific phenomena using the framework of this theory, but you're not required to believe anything other than the empirical adequacy or in the observables, and that is the observables for naked human perception. We also, under the pragmatic component, have an element of semantic realism, where you treat the unobservable entities as science literally talking about them. They're not useful fictions that you'd see in say positivism or instrumentalism, but you don't have to believe in them. You're treating them as if they're true, but you can withhold belief if you so desire. I should also say a bit about the voluntarism that fits in. So with the benefit of hindsight of doing this talk, Juha Saatsi talked a bit about constructive empiricism not really having a centralized epistemology. And I think where the epistemology takes a really central role is from the voluntarism that I see as being absolutely vital to constructive empiricism, and I don't really think that constructive empiricism would be able to function without the voluntarism. So the voluntarism is the epistemological, it's the theory of rationality that underpins constructive empiricism. It's an incredibly liberal theory of rationality that allows for essentially anything to be rational, your belief and your sets of beliefs to be rational, so long as they adhere to a set of very minimal conditions, such as probabilistic coherency, logical coherency, and something like the no Dutch books theorem. You can't, if your sets of beliefs lead to a Dutch book scenario, then they that is irrationality. So this underpins a lot of what Van Fraassen is saying in constructive empiricism, and is the motivating component of what constructive empiricism is, and several parts of this. So, for example, the observable, unobservable distinction that occurs in Van Fraassen, the best, and I think the only way to make sense of him just presenting this division along the lines of sensory experience and not giving an argument for it, this makes complete sense under voluntarism, because all we need to say is that there is, it's not irrational to do this. It's perfectly logically and probabilistically consistent, but it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And I don't think, and I think this is the best way to understand the motivations for constructive empiricism as operating under voluntarist framework. And this is where the sort of epistemology first comes from that I'm talking about. So constructive empiricism and epistemic empiricism, how does this fit into it? Well, firstly, with the individualistic component, I take this to be really evident from the component about theory acceptance, Van Fraassen. What Van Fraassen wants to focus on is, as a really key element, is what it is for an individual to accept a theory. And then we see the subdivisions into epistemic and pragmatic. So the second is centrality of sense perception. Well, in chapter 1 of Scientific Image, as I've just talked about, he draws the observable and unobservable dichotomy around what a human and what the epistemic community of humans can observe. Third, no metaphysics. Well, the focus on accepting a theory, it involves only belief in the observable for humans. So anything that goes beyond what is observable for humans, we don't need to hold belief into. And so I take this to be a clear sort of anti-metaphysical strain. Based more theoretically than practically, well, the central focus again is around theory acceptance. And when Van Frissens in quantum mechanics and empiricist view sort of goes on to analyze the possibility of what the world is like, he does this through examining quantum mechanics as a theory and not as sort of going into the world and investigating in such a way. So the influence by skepticism and sort of epistemic skepticism, I think this is probably where it becomes a bit more controversial. Van Frissens definitely would not want to call himself a skeptic. He repeatedly asserts this in several places, such as Laws of Symmetry, and in a paper in 2000 called On the False Hopes of Traditional Epistemology. And the argument, and the way that this would be defended is that he's making a positive argument based on his voluntarism. There's the justification, the epistemic justification is, it's a positive way of formulating this rather than being any sort of motivated by skepticism in a sort of negative sense of falling back on things. So just a quick recap of methodological empiricism before I go on to Cartwright. And the first part of Cartwright's empiricism is that it's methodologically focused. So it's not focused around epistemology. Cartwright does not engage with this, or at least not as a prominent part of her work. What she's concerned instead with, which becomes really apparent through texts like The Dappled World, is that she's concerned with the world itself. And here's a quotation from Nature's Capacity. She says, "My concern is not with meaning, but with method." Cartwright is really thoroughly focused on practice rather than theory. And I think this just falls straight out of the methodological focus. If we have as an empiricist methodology that we're going to get knowledge of the world for empirical investigation, then what we should be focusing on is what works in practice rather than what works in principle or what works in theory. So the correct place to turn in order to understand the world is scientific practice, not scientific theories. And we should be concerned with what works in practice and not with what works in theory. Here's a quote from right at the beginning of The Dappled World. She says, "I'm an empiricist. I know no guide to principle except successful practice." We have two examples that I just want to go through very quickly. Phenomenological laws versus fundamental laws and how the laws of physics lie. That really exemplify this. She is a realist about phenomenological laws because they are empirically verified. They are empirically demonstrated. The phenomenological laws give us empirically descriptive predictions which are verifiable and are largely correct. So she's a realist about them because they connect to empirical reality. She's an anti-realist about fundamental laws because they don't connect to empirical reality without certain bridging principles and without certain models to connect them. We have quantum mechanics and classical mechanics. So here the point is that because we use both quantum and classical mechanics, we can't say that classical mechanics has been replaced by quantum mechanics. Obviously, the response to this is just going to be that, well, in theory, quantum mechanics can replace classical mechanics as a limiting case, but Cartwright, as will hopefully be clear by now, is not concerned with what works in theory. She's concerned with what works in practice. So a quotation that she says right at the start of Dappled World again is, my studies of the most successful applications of quantum theory teach me that quantum physics works in only very specific kinds of situations that fit the very restricted set of models it can provide. And it has never performed at all well where classical physics works best. So her skepticism is focused towards the extrapolation of ontological significance of entities beyond where they have been demonstrated to be real. And the dappled world view that she has it follows naturally as a result of her empiricism. She says that if we're going to go and investigate the world with no a priori assumptions, what we're going to find from the empirical data is not a unified world. It's not a world, it's not a fundamentalist conception of the world where everything can be reduced or that there's this like neat unity. The empirical data, she says, points to a dappled world and to a world of disunity and non-fundamentalism. So she really wants to reject this idea of fundamentalism, and she says that it's an a priori assumption that it's thoroughly non-empiricist. We have a removal of the importance of the unobservable-observable distinction, and I take this to sort of be a consequence of two. If we're actually going to turn to and investigate scientific practice, then we realize that human naked eye observation isn't central. So this is from How the Laws of Physics Lie. She says, many of the things that are realities for physics are not things to be seen. They are non-visual features, the spin of an electron, the stress between the gas surface, the rigidity of the rod. Observation, seeing with the naked eye, is not the test of experience here. So the focus turns to measurement and experiments and not on naked observation. There's a general willingness to endorse metaphysics. I guess we see this most in terms of her monographs, we see this most fully in nature's capacities and their measurements. And so Cartwright endorses capacities and causality because she thinks we can really measure capacities and causality in some significant sense. So the final few minutes, I just want to talk about the dominance of epistemic empiricism, and a really crucial way that most of this sort of evidence is going to rest on is to do with a contrast between realism and empiricism. I take it that if the author is contrasting realism and empiricism, then they are definitely not talking about methodological empiricism, because methodological empiricism is compatible with realism. So Van Frissens in 1980, in the introduction to Scientific Image, frequently contrasts realism and empiricism. And like I say, if you're contrasting realism with empiricism, it's definitely not a type of methodological empiricism you're talking about, because those two aren't dichotomous in any clear sense. The anthology Images of Science, Essays on Realism and Empiricism is the really excellent anthology that comes out several years after the Scientific Image, which comes in direct response to Van Frissens, to the Scientific Image. The subtitle is Essays on Realism and Empiricism. Selos on Empiricism and Realism. So he says, where many philosophers have thought that these two positions are incompatible, or at any rate very strange bedfellows, Cartwright tried to make a case for the combination of the two. Kurd and Selos, in the Routledge Guide to Philosophy of Science, they say the renaissance of scientific realism in the 1960s resulted in an epistemic optimism with regards to science's claim to truth. So new forms of empiricism emerged in the 1980s. So again, we see it contrasted with scientific realism, and we see scientific realism is supposed to be this like epistemic optimism about what we can know about truth, and they're saying that empiricism is not such a thing. So Bird, in his forthcoming monograph, characterizes empiricism as being something like the following: observation is the foundation of scientific knowledge. Evidence is observational in nature, and observation is primarily a matter of sense perception. So this is characterizing epistemic empiricism, whereby sense experience is, things are focused around sense experience. It's not touching on methodological empiricism. And Bird would be happy to acknowledge that the empiricism that he's focusing on is not the methodological sort. Massimi says, current philosophy of science is being characterized by a lively and ongoing debate between two main positions, realism and empiricism. Bueno in 2018 in the entry for empiricism in the Routledge Scientific Realism Handbook, the focus is on this epistemic brand of empiricism. So we have a focus around the observable distinction, discussion on the importance of observation, etc. Johansson, this is there's a typo there. In Empiricism and Philosophy of Physics, he purports to give a comprehensive account of empiricism, but he only looks at this empiricist strain. There's no real mention of Cartwright. There's no mention of Cartwright, of Bacon, or any empiricism aside of this. So I want to just really quickly focus on two objections that are sort of on opposite sides of the spectrum here. The first objection is, do we really need the division? Can't we just characterize them both in the same way, as knowledge comes from experience and experience is just characterized differently? Well, I think this distinction does some work, but it's far from complete. It misses the practice versus theory distinction. It misses that one is largely unconcerned with epistemology, whereas the other is, and it misses that one doesn't really adhere to the observable for humans distinction. And I think this distinction of experience by itself would warrant a distinction. And the other one, which is on the opposite end of the spectrum, is that they seem like such different positions. How can they really be called empiricism coherent? So in conclusion, there exist two strains within empiricism, which are methodological and epistemic. Cartwright fits into the methodological tradition, and Van Frassen's constructive empiricism fits into the epistemic tradition. The methodological tradition has been heavily neglected in current philosophy of science when it comes to critiquing empiricism. And finally, philosophers of science who are concerned with empiricism should pay more attention to this methodological strain. And the last point is really my key takeaway from this talk. I think that, yeah, the talk can be, the main message of this talk is that more attention should be paid to the methodological strain when it comes to critiques of empiricism. So I'll end it there, and thank you very much if you've got this far in the video.